Welcome back to another Fantasy Guru show. It is Friday, and what that means is the Premier League is back. I am joined by my regular co-host on the Fantasy Show, Haider. How are you doing today, Haider?
Good, mate. Just not really used to these Friday kickoffs. They're just throwing me off every single week. I mean, you messaged me last night saying we're playing on Friday again, or there's a game on Friday. So, yeah, just adjusting to that and looking at my team and thinking, what am I going to do? But that's what this show is for.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of people are like, especially when there's that Friday kickoff, because then it makes you have to change your team by about 6:30 on the Friday, and it's a nightmare when it's a smaller matchup where it's like this week it's Newcastle and Palace, and I don't think there's going to be many players that people will own in this game, and it just means having to make those decisions a lot earlier. And it also makes it even more important that you kind of tune into what happens in the news conferences. The problem is that we have is some are early, and then some don't do it till later on in the day, where it's about an hour or two before you have to make your pick. So it's a tough one, and I guess that's what we'll be kind of talking about to start here. Before we kind of move on, just everybody, just make sure you like, subscribe to the page. You can follow Spotify. All the links you can see down there, and they'll be in the description anyway. So we'll start off with some of the big kind of news that came in this week. So obviously there was a lot of drama around what will happen with Mo Salah. So I know that there was a kind of a loophole that Liverpool seemed to get around, where normally I think it's like 11 or 12 days from your last test that it's supposed to be that you're allowed to come back, but Liverpool were somehow able to get around that, and they said it is from his first test, and now that he's doesn't isn't testing net or positive anymore, that he got to play in the Champions League and is back this week, and probably gives a lot of more problems to fantasy owners trying to fit him back into your teams, because look, it's from last week it was difficult for a lot of fantasy owners to keep him, because having a 12.2 million player that's on your bench, you're not going to get a lot of points when you have something like that going on, because there's not many players you can kind of bring in for him. So again, that's one of the big news. And then the other thing that I think we're going to have to speak about is, again, COVID and also the injury problems that we've been seeing. Now, there's a couple that I think impact fantasy. Most of the big guns are back this week. You see, there's not too many huge injuries other than the obvious, with the likes of Trent, Van Dijk, all them that are out for more long term. But from some of the news that we saw this week, so Ross Barkley came off early in the game last week. So there's been some people that would have him in the team. Obviously, Wilfred Zaha didn't play last week because he got COVID. So he's out this week as well, maybe back next week. The big one, I think, is Luca Dean. It was reported this week that he was getting surgery done on an injury. So he's going to be out for the foreseeable future. So, and then obviously today I just saw that Pogba and McTominay are out of the game for this weekend for Manchester United. I think if you're looking at fantasy purposes, there might be a few people that have Pogba. So those are kind of the main ones that you see. Not the same as last week where we're missing the likes of Salah, but one of the kind of bigger news ones there, probably Zaha and Luca Dean. What do you think of those players missing, and what do you think fantasy owners are going to have to try and do with them being gone this week?
Well, I've got Zaha, so it's a real struggle because last week I did the right move and I brought in Bruno Fernandes, captained him, and obviously he did all right, didn't he, last week? But it's the balance between whether you're going to bring Salah back in or not. And that's what I'm toying with right now. Now, I didn't realize he played in the Champions League, which is actually quite big then, or he was in the squad, because it means then he'll definitely play. But you're looking at the fixtures. It's against Brighton and Hove Albion. You might see the Klopp not risk him. I think Jota might be a better option. And for me, Jota would be a good replacement. Anyone that has got Zaha hasn't got Jota. I think Jota very much could be a great option. And there's a really good video on Tifo, which I know I shouldn't really be promoting Tifo because it's a rival. Obviously, they're a lot better than us at the moment, or bigger than us, put it that way. But they did one on how Liverpool's front three has become a front four, where Klopp is now, instead of Jota being sitting on the bench, he's now bringing him to play. And they played almost 4-2-4 against Man City, didn't they? With Jota in there, Mane and Salah. So yeah, looking at that, Luca Dino, as you said, is the obvious one. I've got Nick Pope in goal. So that's a big one for me. Question is, do I keep him? Because he's actually been in fantastic form. I think the last 2 games for me, he's got me clean sheets as well as bonus points. Last game, he was man of the match, and he got 3 bonus points, got me 10 points. So that's another one. I've got McCarthy on the bench, so that's that rotation option I like to do. Sam Maximan is out as well. Actually, that's one to watch out for. Pogba, McTominay is a big one for Man United in terms of other selections, because I was under the impression, and you are a United fan as well, that McTominay would probably play. So that means 2 things now for United. They might go more attacking, so you might think maybe I'll bring in Van der Beek, because that will improve also Bruno's chances in terms of creation, because Man United look more threatening going forward, and Bruno sees more of the ball when Van der Beek or someone more creative plays. But also, conversely, then you wouldn't bring in the United defender because they'll be possibly wide open. So you've got to remember as well, Wan-Bissaka, he's 75% likely to play, but the ankle injury, you can very much see him getting rested with PSG next week. And Lindelof's another one as well. So if you're looking to bring in the United defender, you've got to think long and hard. Maybe Tellez might not play as well because of next week's game. This is where you've got a balance at the moment, that some of the big clubs are now playing twice a week until January. So that'd be Manchester United, City, Liverpool, Chelsea, Arsenal, and I believe Spurs as well will be doing that. So the rotation is a big thing for these big clubs. But another one is Lamptey for me. Being banned, I think Lamptey is someone that a lot of people do have. He costs about 4.7 million for me, so I've had the price rise for him. So yeah, Ciaran, honestly, mate, it's a minefield. I don't know what I'm going to do. I really don't. And that's why we're sitting on the show, even though we're meant to be giving our tips. But when we work through it, we should be able to be giving you guys a much clearer picture of what you should be doing in terms of your transfers.
Yeah, it's a big one this week because, like you said, some of the, even when you talk about United there, the likes of when McTominay's out, that could completely change the way United play. Did they then put Matic in to be that cover instead of having Fred and McTominay? And maybe you do having a more attacking lineup, which then may help if you're using any of the kind of United attackers, whether it's Rashford, Bruno. Again, I think Bruno last week was one of the most transferred in players, and probably will continue to be one of those players that people are thinking of as a potential captain kind of going forward, just because of just the way that he has been playing. Even when the team hasn't been playing like perfectly, he's still getting a lot of points. Even in the Champions League, you saw he probably should have got a hat-trick in the first half if he took the penalty. But one of the interesting points that you mentioned was to do with the Liverpool front 4. And while we'll get to it a little bit later, I just wanted to kind of add to something there on Diogo Jota, because I know a lot of people think that, with Salah back, he might be a sub player. But if we go back to when he started kind of playing full-time for Liverpool, so we go back to the Villa game, so he played 90 minutes there. Then he only played 12 minutes against Everton, but then against Sheffield, he played 82, 20 against West Ham, 90 against Man City, and 88 against Leicester. Now, against Man City is kind of when Klopp started to bring in this kind of 4-pronged attack, and you saw it again against Leicester. So, again, obviously with Salah not being in last week, I would expect them still to have kind of those 4 main striker options kind of going forward. When you look at the amount of points that Jota has gotten, even last week, you still had the likes of Mane and Firmino, and kind of the main player that you saw last week that was creating most of the chances was Diogo Jota. So I think it'd be very difficult for right now for Klopp to not have him in the starting team, because he's arguably been one of Liverpool's best players this year. So, and again, that's kind of frightening for some of the opposition kind of fans, because it just seems that every new player that Liverpool bring in is kind of outplaying the previous one. And again, I think that's why at 6.6 million, I think he's an absolute steal if he continues to start. If he starts, I think he's one to be in most teams.
Yeah, he scored 3 in his last 4 game weeks, which surprised me. I didn't actually realize he scored that many. So at that price, it's ridiculous, especially as you said, Barkley's out as well. He was about 6.9 million. So you're not even looking at a top bracket. I mean, I think Jota's a really good player, but I'm talking price-wise, a top asset, not even a medium asset. He's actually on the lower scale of quality. So you're getting a lot of quality for the price. I think it's just about, will he play? I'm not sure Salah will play. I think Klopp can maybe risk resting him against Brighton, a team that's not really great at the back, or they're not really very defensively solid. So I think you could probably say, yeah, Jota will probably play. It's more of a case, will Salah play? And that's what I'm toying with at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that's what a lot of people are as well. Because look, I know he played in the Champions League, but look, it was one of those where they expect the Champions League game to be quite open, and they didn't really get that many chances. I don't know if they even created any sort of chances in the Champions League game. So maybe Salah might be one of those that you have to kind of lean in just or wean in just kind of over the next 2 weeks. You have to remember he's only gotten over COVID, so that does take time, as we've seen for certain players. Anyway, one of the other talking points from last week was in relation to Man City, because a lot of people have been talking about how the fixtures early on the season were quite difficult, and now coming up, they should be going into the kind of good stretch of games. The biggest issue that I think people have is when you look at Man City, the top scorer for them is Raheem Sterling, but it's only 34 points. Man City have struggled to score goals. The attacking players haven't looked the same since the likes of David Silva has been gone. They've been trying to kind of use Foden in that position. They've tried to use kind of Fernan Torres kind of moving more kind of higher up the pitch. But I think with the lack of a kind of out and out striker, with the lack of creativity from the likes of David Silva, is it time to start bringing in some of the Man City players, because there's a few easier games where you'd expect them to be able to dominate? Or is it still one of those where we really need to wait until they actually prove that they're going to do anything? Because really, I know last week a lot of people brought in De Bruyne, and still I think he got 1 or 2 points. It's one of those that I think that's killed a lot of fantasy players, because people are expecting kind of where he went off last week, or last year, where he was one of the top scorers in fantasy, when this year he's probably one of the worst valued players based on the output that he's given.
It's a really, really difficult one. You either play off form or you play off matchups. That's the two ways you've got to look at it. Now, anyone bringing in De Bruyne against Tottenham last week? I mean, did you do that? I don't know if you did that. I brought in Bruno. Anyone that did that was actually, that's a crazy, crazy move. Now, you maybe have done that because you're looking at the next two fixtures, which are against Burnley and Fulham. Now, you expect City to now start hit some form. Then they've got United in the Manchester derby. So that when you're looking at it that way, yeah, I can understand, for example, doing that, taking Salah out. But anyone that's banking on City because of prehistoric, and this is sometimes you should do, though. You do look at the stretch of 38 games in the season. By the end of the season, De Bruyne should be up there or thereabouts at the top. But we're nearly 10 games in now. We are 10 games in with most clubs. So some of them have played 9 games. And they just have not hit form. Looking at the City options, I mean, I don't really think I'll touch any, but I did look at Cancelo, and creating 15 chances in the last 5 game weeks for City. I mean, he's a threat going forward. That's more than any other City player. So if you are looking to bring someone in, you're probably best bringing in a defender. That sounds crazy. They haven't really, had many clean sheets. The last 2 games, they lost to, they had Tottenham, and Tottenham are in good form. Lost 2-0, but it just never looked like they were going to come back. City, when they go a goal down now, you don't really think, right, they're going to go and they're just going to go and grind this side down. And they had a lot of possession against Spurs, but Spurs just cut through them like a knife through butter. So would I be bringing City players in? De Bruyne has been rested, so he didn't play again in the midweek game in the Champions League, so he will be fresh and he will start. And there's a possibility that, you might decide Mahrez. I mean, I had Mahrez in the beginning. That's the only City player I've had, but I took him out. I think there's better options out there in better form who are better value for money. So you're looking at Bruno Fernandes, who is just on ridiculous form. He's not even playing, I don't think, particularly well. I think he's playing well, but I don't think he's necessarily at the highest level he can go. And that's the scary thing, but he just returns every single week and he's on penalties. So would I bring a City player in? I think if you're deciding that you don't want to go for a Liverpool defender, then a Cancelo is a good option. I wouldn't bring in Laporte because I think, although he can be a threat in the box, Cancelo is almost playing as like a left winger when you watch him play. So that would be the player I'd bring in. De Bruyne, it's difficult because Burnley are still a difficult team to break down. And yes, they've scored once in their last 5 games, which is pretty cool. But what they will do is that they will be physical. So I think City will struggle perhaps in that aspect.
Yeah, I agree to that extent, where I think you probably need to stay away from the City attackers until they actually prove that they're going to start hitting form. But the defense is a good option because you look at it and the matchups coming up, you don't expect Burnley to score many goals really in any game. And they probably won't get much of the possession against City to have that many chances. You have seen the same thing with Fulham. They've been one of the kind of weak links in the Premier League this year that really any team kind of playing against Fulham or West Brom, they're kind of, you need to be looking around those players that are going up against them. So with City having both of those games in terms of having Burnley and then having Fulham, it's a really good option. I kind of went through the same thing as, do I put Cancelo in? Because again, I think he's probably, if you're picking a City defender, can garner you the most returns because he probably will get more assists. I know Laporte last week had a goal, but it was disallowed because of the new rules. But again, you do see that kind of he is one of those players that does get in and around the box and does score those goals. But really, other than that, I don't think I'd be touched in any other City players. It's very tough, which I don't think anyone thought they'd say at the start of the season. Everyone expected City to be one of those kind of really, really kind of the firepower teams, but they just haven't proved it yet. And I think that's a big problem. The defending is, I think, in fantasy this year is the biggest issue because so many players or so many teams haven't been able to defend. We've seen goals in pretty much every single game, which I don't think there's been that many really boring games in the Premier League this year. But that also goes to the point of where you allocate those resources. And it kind of brings us to the next point that we're going to make. When we talk about Liverpool, now we spoke about the attacking intent where we have Salah and Jota, but the defensive side is something that's a little tricky. Because look, you're missing Trent, you're missing Gomez, you're missing Fabinho, you're missing Van Dijk. Really, the only one left in that defense is Robertson. And now last week he had 12 points, so he did very well. Liverpool have a couple of handy enough fixtures kind of coming up as well. You'd kind of expect them to do pretty decent this week against, I think it's Brighton that they're playing this week. So there is the chance for Robertson. Now I know he's expensive, but what I wanted to talk about is if there's so many teams that can't defend, should you be looking at some of those Liverpool defenders like Nico Williams, for example, that's only 3.8 million, I think it is, when they might be playing against a team that really won't be able to attack much. So you might get those clean sheet points while not having to spend a lot of kind of cash in terms of in your defense and can kind of invest that extra money in your midfield or your strikers.
A strategy that's worked for me this year is actually getting some of those clean sheets in defense. That's what's helped me the last few weeks. Now, my defense, Lamptey is a goal threat. I've looked for goal threats in my defense. That's key. People, most likely players who are fullbacks, wingbacks, who are going to offer for. I haven't actually got a centre back. I've got Chilwell, who's been fantastic going forward. You've got Lamptey, and you've got who else have I got? Kyle Walker-Peters. But I think the biggest thing is that I don't expect Nico Williams to play. Now, we saw Milner shifting in at right back, and I think that's what's going to happen. Now, Milner's down as a midfielder. He had a really good game, actually, last week. I looked at the statistics. I mean, Robertson's playing genuinely, if you look at statistically, and some people like to do that instead of using their eyes, so we'll do that. Looking at statistically, he's actually playing his best football, especially going forward. He's on corners, for example, so he's got a threat from corners, and that's why you look at the likes of maybe even Tellez, and I think Chilwell's also on corners. So this is I feel like it's a big change this year in the fantasy football, where a lot of fullbacks are almost playing as wingers, I think. And that's, I think, why Trent has struggled a little bit, because what you've seen is actually, if you look at, it's stepping away from fantasy football quickly, but if you look at the average position map of Liverpool this season, Robertson's played really far up, almost as winger, and Trent's not been as progressive. So I think for me, Nico Williams, I would be saying no. But at 3.8 million, that is actually not a bad option to even have on the bench as a Liverpool player. If you're not going to go and have 3 Liverpool players, you've got to remember that as well. So what I would say to that is you've got to find defenders who are going to get you clean sheets. That's what's going to take it to the next level, because there's a lot of good goal-scoring midfielders and attackers, although that's dried up a little bit. but you've got to at least get a couple of clean sheets, which means your goalkeeper choice has to be really shrewd as well. You shouldn't be going for any of the big goalkeepers, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the 2 points you made there is you do, like I've always mentioned, is you look at the matchups to try and get those extra points, but also, and it goes to this idea with Milner as well. He's kind of the opposite kind of example here where you look for defenders that can contribute going forward. So you're looking for the likes of, like you mentioned, Tellez is on corners, you have Robertson, you have the likes of Chilwell, who's plays very high up. You even have Justin for Leicester, who's been pretty solid this year. The one problem I think with Milner has is he's the complete opposite. Even though he's going to be playing at right back, is he's put down as a midfielder, so you don't even get the points for a clean sheet. So really, for anyone bringing him in, I think it's kind of a waste of any sort of resources because you're not going to get much from that. And again, I think it is one that you just have to focus in on those kind of wing backs that are going to be in your team. Like I think my three are Chilwell, Justin, and Robertson. Now, I was torn last week of putting Tellez in because I wasn't sure if he was going to start, but if he keeps playing the way he does, where you're seeing him create chances, then he's one that I think you can really look at to kind of add more quality to that defense. Because look, a lot of the top midfield players, and we've mentioned it on many previous podcasts, it's been very inconsistent. Some are excellent one week and terrible the next. So it is one of those tricky ones, and it kind of brings us to some of the way that we like to do it is on the matchups, because really that's where you can kind of take in control. The people that just pick players because they're the big names, you do well some weeks, but it's usually pretty inconsistent. We'll start it from kind of on the daily basis. So we'll start with the Friday game or tonight's game. There's not much here. Normally you would be talking about kind of Will Zaha, but again, we mentioned earlier he has COVID. Maybe Easy, I know he's back, so there's a chance that for him for Palace. But then really the only other player that kind of sticks out for me is probably Wilson for Newcastle. But other than that, there's really not that much here that I think any fantasy owners want to kind of dip their toe in the water for the Friday night game.
Maybe Van Aanholt, but then again, that's looking at a defender. I think he could possibly be an option. It's a shame because Mitchell, he had a knock now. It doesn't look like he's going to play anymore, so he's someone you're going to have to bring out. He's a fantastic low-budget option very early on. But I agree with you. There's not really much there. Zaha out. It's going to be a bit of a drab game, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And then we move on to the Saturday game. So the first one there, we have Brighton and Liverpool. So how do you see that impacting fantasy for the early game on the Saturday?
I really expect Liverpool to run away with it, if I'm being honest. I think Brighton are a very nice side to watch under Graham Potter, but I do feel like they're very wide open. And Liverpool, the frightening thing I said last week was that Liverpool showed that with all these injuries, I mean, that's pretty much the whole half their team out injured, spine of their team, and they looked so good. So I actually don't expect Liverpool to look any weaker going forward on the front foot. Even defensively, they're looking good, and Klopp's changed it around well. He's played a 4-2-3-1. He's played a 4-2-4. The 4-2-3-1, he's really protecting that defense. He's saying to that front four, because they're so good, and with Robertson, which is why I think Robertson's a great shout. If you're not convinced Salah is going to come back and you've got a bit of money, and let's say you've got Lamptey out and you've got an extra couple of million like I have, I think Robertson's a great shout. And then looking at the game, they've got Wolves, and then they've got, I'm not too sure who they've got after. I'm just going to quickly check. They have got Fulham. So the next three games are Brighton, Wolves, and Fulham. Wolves might be a bit more difficult. Then they've got Tottenham, then Palace after that. So some good games. So yeah, and Jota's another one for me, I think, is a good option. I'm not convinced Salah's going to play. I think he could probably get away with not playing him this week.
Yeah, I think the one there that kind of sticks out is Robertson as the sole player left in that kind of Liverpool defense. In those kind of games that you mentioned there's not many. Look, the Spurs game obviously is one where you'll probably see Spurs attack them pretty well, but other than that, there's not that much. Like you look at Fulham, they haven't been doing much. Wolves, I think they maybe score once a game, if even. It's been drab. I think they have 9 goals in 9 games. It's
thing I've noticed, and that's why I would say to you, and this might bite me in the backside, but Raul Jimenez, you got to take him out. He's not getting in the box.
Yeah.
That's the biggest thing I would say. And Jota not being there is actually massive. They've got a new £35 player. It looks like this, right? It looks like things have got a bit stale at Wolves. They've brought in a lot of good players. I would actually say if you're going to bring anyone into from the Wolves team, it's Ait-Nouri is a good player. He's playing as left wing back. He looks really, really promising. Maybe Semedo, but again, he hasn't really done as much as I expected. I think the biggest problem for me is, they're just not getting into the box. Adama doesn't really seem to be playing as much as well. Pedro Neto is an option there. But I actually think Jimenez's head's been turned, and that's now affecting his. I think he had United and Juve after him, so I think he will be on his way out at some stage.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's only a matter of time before he goes out and the next Portuguese player comes in. That's the way they do it at Wolves. Yeah. The kind of second game that we would see on the Saturday. Now we've spoken a little bit about this already. But the City and Burnley game, look, there's no Nick Pope for that game because he has a head injury. We've mentioned already the City have been struggling to score goals. Burnley don't concede that many chances, but now with Nick Pope not playing, it is a chance for some of these City players to try and upturn their form and kind of get some more results for some of the fantasy owners that have stuck by them. Personally, I don't have a single City player in my team. I know I had Foden for a lot of the season at the start. I think I had De Bruyne in for a week or two. But for me, I think, like I said earlier on, it's one of those until they prove that they can be in form, I'm not picking any City players.
Yeah, I'm the same. I maybe might toy with the idea of Cancelo, possibly. But otherwise, I'm probably gonna avoid that one and just wait till they hit some form, because you don't know what you're gonna see with Man City. It's a bit like United, but then United have got Bruno, and Bruno will impact the game in some way. But you wouldn't probably have Rashford. I wouldn't personally. I wouldn't have Martial. If Cavani plays a bit more, you might have Cavani. Greenwood, again, he's not playing. We don't know if he's going to play week in, week out. So yeah, I think I would probably do a pass on the City players.
Yeah, the next game is probably my kind of game of the week, or the fantasy game of the week, where you really need to kind of focus on. And I think that's Everton and Leeds, because look, I think this is going to be a very, very open game, because Leeds love to attack and they are prone to allowing too much space in that defence, and teams tend to score quite a lot of goals against them. But again, Leeds score a good amount of goals too. You have, like I said earlier, Luca Dean is out. There's been problems with Calvin Phillips for Leeds, even when he came back. I know he went down during the game last time. There's weeks that Meslier in goal is great, and then there's other times where he looks like he's never played in goal before. So I think this is one that you really need to pick out of. You look at Calvert-Lewin, his 7 goals in 9 games, top scorer. In this one, I think even James Rodriguez should be a pretty good option here, because there's a lot of space in that Leeds defence, and that's really where he does a lot of his damage. You could look at Richarlison as well, because he's back, and that only helps all the attacking players, because it seems like once that whole unit is playing together, they're really, really good. But then when you take one player out of it, that's where they kind of struggle. Really, the only person that's been able to kind of stick with it really throughout kind of the Richarlison when he was out was Calvert-Lewin. So in terms of this game for Leeds and Everton, how do you see this one going in terms of fantasy? Do you think this is the one that a lot of fantasy owners need to look out for? Because for me, I think this is one of the main games going forward.
100%. I think you should probably bank more on the forwards than the defenders. Calvert-Lewin is very, very, very consistent. You're saying here that he scored 7 in 9 game weeks. I mean, he's blanked once, and I believe that was against United. And I think Richarlison back is huge. You saw last week against Fulham. When Richarlison plays, he stretches the defence, and it gives Calvert-Lewin so much more time and space. And it's all about service as well. James Rodriguez is a very good option to be bringing in, I think. And I didn't even think about him until you just mentioned him. The other thing as well is that when you look at Leeds, very free-flowing, problems defensively. And also, Everton have had problems defensively. In the last 6 game weeks, they've conceded at least 2 goals a game. That's ridiculous. They're so open at the back. And I know that's something Ancelotti's getting annoyed. I mean, they conceded 2 against Fulham. So another thing as well is that Patrick Bamford, he's just defying all the odds, isn't he? How 6 of his 7 goals, I believe, have been on the road. So they are away at Goodison. And when you're looking at Bamford as well, he's averaging about 9.8 points per game on the road. I mean, I said to you earlier on, I said he's going to be in bursts. He's going to score for a little bit and he's going to stop. He might still do that leading up to Christmas. But, I mean, I don't have him on my side. I took him out very early on and then he went and scored 17 points after that. But he's definitely an option now. If you don't want to go and spend big on the defense, maybe you want to bring in a Cancelo instead of a Robertson. And in midfield, maybe you want to bring a Jota for Zaha instead of Salah. Then you have a little bit of money to play. I think you would be crazy not to have at least one of Calvert-Lewin and Bamford. I mean, I've gone for Calvert-Lewin, but I got Brewster on the bench, and I'm thinking he's playing, but he's not doing anything, you know. So, bless you.
Thank you.
Get a little sneeze there if you're listening to this. So he's gonna cry there. The thought of Brewster on the bench. No, so that's definitely an option if you don't want to. If you're unsure about your midfield, because there are a few players that are out or who have lost a bit of form. Like Hammond is a player that's lost a little bit of form, I would say. So he's a bit of a risk. I don't know. Do you think he's a risk? I think he's a little bit of a risk to bring in because he's not really. Yeah, I know he's been injured, but
yeah,
you could go up and down in form, and that's something that does worry me a little bit.
Yeah, I think when you watch the games, Hammers he's playing well, but he has that terrible fantasy stat of where he's getting the assist of the assist. So he's getting it to someone who then passes it, and then it seems Calvert-Lewin is scoring instead of it being just from him, and it's really affected him. You see it a lot where it goes really from James to Richarlison to Calvert-Lewin, and it's a goal. That's kind of the way Everton like to play it. And unfortunately, when early on you saw James creating most of those chances himself, but now he's kind of more ingrained within the team, and it's not so much that he's putting in that killer pass, it's more of he's setting someone else through and then the pass to score. It's been unfortunate, but that's why it's kind of the same to a certain extent with Villa, with Grealish sometimes now, because there's more than just him. That some weeks he's going to get big points because he's able to get those assists, able to get those goals, but because he's so creative, he's creating for other players, and it opens up space, and then they're not really getting those assists. So it's a difficult one. Look, if there was some stat where they got points for playing the pass before an assist, you'd be doing really well with James. But the way it is, he's just one that I think right now you probably can't. The only reason why, if you were thinking this week with like Zaha that's out, maybe you bring him in because he's at a similar value and playing against a Leeds team that really are quite open defensively. It brings us to kind of the next game. There's not too much that we kind of really need to talk about this one in terms of West Brom and Sheffield United. There's really not much to go on here. There's not many. I don't think there'll be many players that people will be using from these two teams. I see it's probably a pretty boring game, but I probably expect West Brom to do quite well in this one because Sheffield United, they really look like a team that don't know what they're doing, and it's a big, big issue if they can't turn this around soon.
I actually think West Brom are going to be they actually are quite an attacking team. We've said this before on the Away End show last week. If you actually want to hear about West Brom and their attacking or their style of play, then maybe check it out. Against United, they were actually very, very pragmatic. Against Spurs, they weren't so pragmatic, actually. They had a lot of chances. When you look at the way West Brom play, I think they're going to be the ones that take the onus on themselves to attack. It's Sheffield United who I'm really worried about. I tweeted 2 games in, second season syndrome. I got slaughtered for it. And I'm getting proven correct. Now, they should not be sacking Chris Wilder at all. That they should just not do that. They should do what Burnley, if they go down, I know it's off topic, but if Burnley went down, Sean Dyche, they kept him, they went back up, they should do that. But it's more to do with the fantasy points. You could probably look at a defender, maybe someone like Ivanovic if you want in their defense. But to be honest with you, I'd be avoiding it like a rash.
Yeah, and then to kind of go through, there's probably in the last couple of games, there's 4 that kind of really step out in terms of fantasy. Look, the United Southampton game, I think we've mentioned before with Bruno as kind of one of the main options there. Southampton, we've seen the likes of Che Adams and we've seen James Ward-Prowse that a lot of people brought in. I think that game is pretty self-explanatory where I think there's going to be a lot of attacking intent. But where I kind of want to focus in on from the last couple of games are kind of two games in particular, the Chelsea and Spurs game, because it's one of the biggest games of the weekend. It's a hard one to know how open it's going to be because we don't know how Chelsea are going to play. Sometimes they play really defensive football and just don't want to concede. And then other times we see them going all out attack. I assume that it's going to be a pretty cautious game. And again, I guess the other thing is, though, when you look at the teams, Chelsea have won the last 3 meetings between Chelsea Spurs. They won both the Premier League games last year. I think Lampard's beaten Mourinho in, I think it was all the games so far as managers. So it's a tough one in terms of, do you take some of those history books where it's at Stamford Bridge, which shouldn't be a big issue because there's no crowd. But I guess that allows Lampard to be more defensive, and maybe it might halt Son and Kane, which a lot of fantasy players are probably banking on.
100% Lampard will do what he did against United. I have no doubts about that. It's actually probably one of the easier decisions this week. Frank Lampard's found something in the big games which works now. He's going to be much more conservative. I think he'll go 3 at the back. Again, it depends on injuries, but I think that's what he'll most likely do, and he will look to play on the counter. Now, the funny thing is, though, that's what Spurs do as well. They look to play on the counter. I do think Spurs will go for it. I think they'll do exactly what they do usually, but even though Lampard will go more defensive, I think Chelsea will have more of the ball. That's just Mourinho's MO in big games. Now, it worked last week, and actually in the second half against City, they should have had more. I mean, they won 2-0. At one stage, it was like 38% possession for Spurs, but they've got the players to hurt any team on the break. And that's the reality of it. I do really think that this Tottenham side, barring injuries, for me, has been the most impressive side so far in the league. As crazy as some people might think, I really do. People say you can't judge on 10 games whether they're title contenders. They are title contenders. If you've got Son and Kane in that form, you're title contenders. Tongi Ndombele is another player. He got an assist last week. He's looking really, really good. Their defense is looking solid. Sergio Reguilon is really, really brilliant going forward, and someone I wanted at United, as you know. So when looking at that game, yeah, I think Chelsea will hope not to lose, but in the end, I think they'll have more possession. I'm keeping my Chelsea. Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because I've got 2 Chelsea and 2 Spurs players. I've got Ziyech, I've got Chilwell, I've got Kane, I've got Son. Now, there's a question. Could you do a free hit for this week? I wouldn't risk it. Someone's asked me that. Should I free hit it for this week? I said, wait for a double game week. But serious questions to be asked. I'd be keeping both Son and Kane. I'm probably going to keep Chilwell and Ziyech as well. And I'm just going to ride it out because, look, it's a long-term game. You can't be doing it on week by week. Maybe this week I'll get less points, but in the long run, I won't have to sub them out to bring them back in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the right way to go forward. I guess the last thing to kind of talk about, and it's just because I think it's one of the really good matchups if you're looking for that striker, is Jamie Vardy this week, because look, they're up against Fulham. Again, we've seen the issues that Fulham have had. There's really not much else in terms of players coming in for Leicester. There hasn't been too many other big kind of fantasy points. So I think Jamie Vardy's one to kind of look out for there. It's kind of one of the kind of bigger matchups. The other two where we have Villa and West Ham and Arsenal and Wolves, look, I don't think there's going to be too many chances created in either one of those games. You might have a couple goals in the Villa and West Ham based on how West Ham set up. But the Arsenal Wolves game, it would be a very hard watch, I think, if you're going to sit through that 90 minutes. But especially when there's so many other good games this weekend, that one's going to be, I think, a tough watch for any fans of those teams. Do you agree with some of those points, or is there anything else that you wanted to add on before we move on to our next segment?
When have we ever seen Arsenal be the side that doesn't play beautiful football? It's actually crazy. In some ways, it's kind of sad. I hate Arsenal, but it's sad because Arsenal are a side that you always could bank on with a few players. You always thought, right, Aubameyang's going to score, or you could have, in years gone by, you could have had Ozil, or you could have even had Bellerin, for example. You can't have any. Well, actually, you can have their defenders. I will say that they're very good defensively. So, if you are looking for a Arsenal player in defense, I think Gabriel's a great shout. Kieran Tierney's another one, and you could possibly even go for the goalkeeper in that. It's going to be a boring game. They're not going to create enough. I believe their goal of the season was a Aubameyang penalty. I mean, that makes even more ridiculous how United lost that game. But looking at it, Cresswell's an option. I think he's been one of the best defenders. He's very creative as well. But I think Villa have been impressive. And the only other thing about Vardy, I've not been that high on Vardy. I'm going to tell you why. I know he'll get returns. That's the thing. But I said this maybe a month ago. When it comes to fantasy football, there's so many forwards that are scoring goals, but you need more than that. You need assists. And Vardy doesn't really offer as much. He'll be on penalties. He'll score. He's got 3 double-digit returns in 7 game weeks. So that just shows how effective he has been. But I'd be having Kane over him, Calvert-Lewin, especially the prices he's at. He's about 10.2 million, 10.1.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And that kind of brings us on to our last kind of one, where there's a couple of the questions that usually come in kind of every week on the players to kind of transfer in and out, some of the players to kind of look forward to kind of moving forward. I think we've mentioned a lot of these already in some of our past segments. So I'll get kind of like a one-word response from you for who do you think the top player to bring in week 10 would be?
Jota.
Very good. The other one that people always look for is kind of those differential players. Is there any that have kind of stuck out to you that would be a good one kind of going forward, or even for this week as a differential?
Tough one. I'm going to say Cancelo.
Yeah, Cancelo's a good one. I think the only other one that kind of, when I was looking at the numbers, that kind of pointed out there today was Rafinha for Leeds as a possibility as well. He's a pretty decent option. And then I guess the last thing is, and this is the biggest question I think everybody asks, we always are messaging each other right before the deadline here, is who the hell should we captain for this week?
Oh, it's so difficult. It's so difficult. I'm going to say Calvert-Lewin, and I haven't captained him once yet. But I just think the amount of goals that Leeds concede, and they're not going to change the way they play. And in some ways, I kind of admire that. They go, I'll play what I'm going to play. It won't win you titles, but it's exciting. And Leeds will always look to score goals. They're very open at the back. I believe their defense is amongst the worst. So, yeah, I would say Calvert-Lewin, possibly Bruno, because United are very good away. But I don't trust United. I captained Bruno last week out of a spur of the moment rather than any skill involved.
Well, it worked out for you last week, so hopefully you can do the same thing this week. I'd say for me, I think the biggest option probably is Calvert-Lewin, just because of how open I expect Leeds to be. So I'd say for me, that's probably a big option. Again, you have Bruno as well. You could pick one of the Liverpool players, but look, it's tough. I think this might be a week to not have Son or Kane as your captain, because again, I don't know how much attacking returns they'll be able to get against Chelsea if they want to defend. I can't see that game being too wide open. So I think looking at some of the matchups, I think one of the Everton players, so I think Calvert-Lewin makes sense. So for me, that would be my ideal kind of captain this week. Thanks for joining me this week, Haider. I know it's another one of those early weeks for fantasy football, and everybody needs to get their fix in before 6:30 today. So it was a pleasure seeing your face again on a Friday just before we have to pick our teams. But hopefully a lot of the listeners got to learn a couple of things right before the deadline.
Absolutely. And I actually feel a lot better after doing that, because now I kind of an idea what I'm going to do. So that's, you know what, we when we work through it as well, we actually make our choices. So yeah, Ciaran, pleasure as always, mate.
Yeah, absolutely.
And thank you to all the listeners, and make sure you check us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Good luck for this week, and we'll see you next time.